It's time for some collective wisdom, a podcast advancing the cannabis revolution, one conversation at a time. We all benefit from sharing knowledge and experiences. So if you want to learn about the business of cannabis from those in the trenches, you've come to the right place. Here's your host, Lisa Tollner, co-founder of SensiChew.
Hello, we are recording today at MJ BizCon in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I am here with Swetha Kaul, Scientific Advisor for Cannalysis. Now, Swetha provides scientific guidance for testing processes and protocols for Cannalysis, who is a laboratory that is ISO and IEC accredited for testing cannabis, and they seek to empower their customers through technology integrations, big data analytics, and access to information. Swetha has an MS in pharmacology and toxicology and a PhD in analytical chemistry from University of Kansas. Her experience working in highly regulated markets and the highly regulated pharmaceutical industry provides valuable insights into the rigorous scientific practices required for compliance. Her experience presenting scientific concepts and data to various audiences has proven to be invaluable. She has authored several white papers and has been on numerous panels discussing scientific methods and regulations relating to laboratory testing within the industry. She's also a member of the California Cannabis Industry Association Board of Directors and chair of Quality Control Committee. Swetha is committed to educating the general public about the science behind testing procedures and legitimizing the cannabis industry by setting a high bar for scientific integrity. Swetha, welcome to Collective Wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Consistent lab testing is one of the most important aspects of adoption for our industry so that the consumer feels safe, they know the products have been rigorously tested, and that what they're getting is good quality and what they expect. So obviously that's a really important part of what you do at Cannalysis and what you do professionally. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the standardization of testing and the challenges and opportunities related to that?
Of course. Lab testing is really important because it is that last barrier before taking products to the final consumer. We're very uniquely positioned in the supply chain. When products go from distribution to retail, at least in California, they have to get final compliance testing from a lab. So we are that final gatekeeper, and it is important to educate people about the level of testing that we're doing. In California right now, we have some of the strictest standards. We're testing for heavy metals, residual solvents, pesticides, microbial contamination, and a whole host of other things. And this is really important, and it's important to inform people what we're testing to. But on the flip side, it's a new industry, and it's really hard to develop some of these standards. Some of these testing has been done before in other industries. You know, some of these pesticides have been tested for with the EPA. Some of these microbials have been tested in the food industry. So there are other industries that we can borrow from. But the way analytical chemistry and testing works is you have to prove and validate that you can do that level of testing in that specific type of product. So even though I can say I know how to detect mold, I have to prove that I can detect mold in cannabis, and not just in cannabis, in various cannabis products. Because as you know, cannabis now comes in all shapes and forms, and we call this the matrix. The matrix is everything else apart from what we're testing for. And as we all know, people are putting cannabis and CBD in anything imaginable. We have products that range from bath bombs and lip balms and lotions and tinctures and a whole gamut of things. And what they bring with them is different levels of complexity in testing and different things that can potentially interfere with them. So one of the things that you can do with standardization is there is something called an ISO accreditation. So ISO 17025 is the analytical testing accreditation. This is done by a third party. So we bring in someone else to make sure that we actually can meet to those standards. And what ISO basically looks for is documentation, traceability, make sure that you are doing things consistently and in the same way you have SOPs for things. ISO is great for that, but what ISO doesn't check for is how accurate are your methods? Are these methods right for this? And unfortunately, you kind of need an overarching body to do that. The state regulators need to catch up. It would be awesome to have a reference lab, but we don't have that right now. And so a lot of labs have now fallen on their own devices to kind of prove hey, this is what we're seeing. And some of the differences you're seeing is because those standards are different. I think we'll get there. Every industry that matures will get there eventually. But the way they get there is by sharing methods. And right now, the industry holds a lot of things as trade secrets and, don't share this because it's proprietary. And until we start being more open and transparent, it's going to be hard to say where the bar is because everyone's going to do it slightly differently. And in Cannalysis, we believe in transparency and sharing methods. When the vape crisis happened with the vitamin E acetate, we actually published a paper on the method for detecting vitamin E acetate. We did it in a collaboration with SciEx, which is one of the vendors of mass specs. And I think we need to see that level of trust and engagement all across the board. So, eventually I would love to see labs start publishing their pesticide methods, their heavy metals methods, things that come up, things that are different or unique. With edibles and gummies, there's always all kinds of interferences involved in it. If you solve it, it would be great to actually share that with the public. How did you solve this? How did you figure out how to extract the cannabinoids out of these difficult, complex things? But for the most part, it's going to be a waiting game. We'll get there. People have to be patient and share and be more transparent and have conversations like this.
And, it's interesting you say that because from my own perspective and experience, we've given laboratories the exact same sample and got all different results.
Yes.
So clearly that's exactly what you're speaking to is these different protocols and processes because they're not standardized means that everyone's going to do it a little differently and hence a lack of consistency.
Exactly. And edibles is a great example of that because the way that testing works for cannabinoids is actually very similar and it's very simple. When most people are using some kind of UPLC or HPLC method with a UV detector, maybe a mass spec if they want to be a little fancy, and the standards that are provided to us are very similar, and we all have the same PT tests. And I can guarantee you, if I take my solvent standard and send it to multiple labs, we'll probably be within 5% of each other. The main barrier is actually getting it out of these edibles, getting it out of these, complicated matrices. And how you get them out is very different lab to lab. And that's the main barrier right now. And that's actually not as scientifically complicated, and I would love for people to be able to share that more. If we have a unique way of homogenizing or trying to extract it using a specific solvent, maybe that needs to get shared more easily. And, I've started to do that a lot more with a lot of lab directors where most of us have a very open conversation with each other. How do we get these methods better? We need to do that in a more public manner so everyone has access to that information.
Are there conferences like MJ BizCon or even within your laboratory setting, are there sessions where it would make absolute sense to bring this together and make it a track at the conference where there's sharing going on? So is some of that starting to materialize at all?
It is. We have a couple of scientific conferences specific to cannabis. You have the Emerald Conference, there's Analytical Cannabis, some of the AAPS, which is the Pharmaceutical Association, and ASMS, which is for mass spec, they're actually having cannabis tracks within them. What I would love to see is within a regular cannabis conference having a science track. The scientists are all about this kind of collaboration, but in order to really bridge that gap, I think it'd be awesome to see some of our industry association type events also have a science track where you elevate the science and you give a platform for the scientists to talk. Because every time I've spoken about the science at events like this, people are super interested. They're always asking questions. People are hungry for information. You're right. I think we need to have more platforms like this that makes that information available. And most scientists are open to questions. This is how we learn. Maybe you have a question that I haven't even thought about, like, oh, that's a good way of looking at it. Maybe we should try it this way. And that collaboration is how we get to a better place, and we just need to do it more in a positive direction, because I think testing labs have also been sort of on the negative end of the industry, right? I think there's been a lot of bad experiences, and there's been a slight combative and mistrust sort of built up between manufacturers and testing labs. And I honestly think the way you move forward is by bridging that gap, sharing information, but at the same time it has to go both ways, right? If a lab is transparent about mistakes, you can't bludgeon them with it. You have to be open to the fact that just like manufacturing mistakes happen on the floor, lab mistakes also happen. And so if that openness is there, then labs would not be scared of sharing that kind of information. I think right now they're scared because they don't know if they share something, is that going to be ripped apart? Are people going to be completely unhappy?
Are they going to lose business?
Exactly. So we need to make that barrier of fear a lot lower, and I'm not sure how we do that, actually. I mean, that's something that I think has to be an open-ended question that we have to work collectively on.
Tell us a little bit about your views on the vaping crisis. You did mention the work you did in terms of defining more specifically the E-acetate, vitamin E-acetate carrier, but it's still something that is a little bit of a dark cloud that is hovering over the industry. And although there's been some vindication where the industry has been deemed the good agent here, unlike maybe just a few bad characters or the illegal market or e-cigarettes, but there still remains a little bit of a dark shadow.
Yep.
How do we get past that?
So it's really interesting. I was actually speaking at a vaping panel right before this, and there was a lot of questions about this same kind of thing. The vaping crisis, honestly, was handled very poorly by the media. It almost seemed like this very coordinated, very hyperbolic, very panic-ridden and extreme messaging. And it wasn't based on any reality. If you looked at the CDC reports, they were consistently saying, hey, majority of this is coming from the illegal market. There was also a lot of confusion of messaging happening initially where they were talking about they need to stop marketing to kids. But most people on the legal market kind of looked at some of that and said, well, we don't. And the regulated legal cannabis industry has very strict advertising, and we cannot market to kids. Everything has to be very by the book, and it's very heavily regulated. And so there was a little bit of conflation happening with the e-cig industry. There was like a multi-pronged approach in which the industry was able to deal with it. I think a lot of the trade organizations were able to put their differences aside and actually come together. There was this like broad coalition where everyone essentially said, this is not a legal issue. This is an illegal vaping issue. This is because there is no access in some of these places. And the way we combat it is not by banning things and driving more business to the illegal side. The way you combat it is by opening access in places. If in LA, for instance, there are streets where people know you can go and buy very cheap, very illegal, very untested products. And if you enforce it strictly and you remove the people off the street, they're just going to show up somewhere else. The way you stop it is you treat it like Starbucks, and there's one on every corner. And now people know that they go there. The same thing happened with prohibition with alcohol. Once it was easily accessible, no one's buying alcohol from moonshine or someone's backyard because it's easily accessible, even if it's cheaper. You're like, why bother? I can just walk down the street and get it. So I think access is going to be a huge issue. The industry did get vindicated because I think a lot of our messaging was about legal versus illegal, but that wasn't a very sexy message. And so media didn't really pick up on that until the CDC actually said, no, this is an illegal versus legal. A lot of the hysteria, I feel, is dying out. The last CDC report that came out showed a very steep decrease in the number of vaping-related illnesses. I think that's been good. A lot of states are starting to talk about rolling back some of the bans and some of the restrictions, which is great. But the best thing I would say this has started is an open conversation of what is allowed to be in a vaping pen. And I think the way the industry has responded to that, honestly, is kind of admirable for a very young industry, right? There's so many conversations that I've been part of where people are talking about, hey, this additive, is there any data on inhalation toxicity? Should we be doing terpenes that are plant-based or cannabis-based? I mean, there's all these very nuanced conversations happening around it. But people are being transparent about it, and most of the legal manufacturers are disclosing exactly what they're putting in their products. Something to think about the vitamin E acetate is even people who are using it, there wasn't anything illegal about that. There was no regulation saying
Correct.
You shouldn't use this. It was just that we're in such a new industry that commercialization came before R&D. And so now we're doing R&D to try and catch up with the commercial product. And unfortunately, R&D does not move at the same pace. It takes years to collect data. So we might run into a few more issues like this. But I think having that nuanced approach is what will ultimately help us. It's just not a very good media narrative. I think the way we tackle that media narrative is we probably need to be a lot more aggressive in our initial approach. I think the industry was very tentative in those early days of the hysteria because we're like, let's wait for the data, guys. Let's stay calm. I think it should have been, hold on a sec. You're putting out information that's just false and based on any kind of data to back this up. I think it could have been a little more aggressive in those early days. But overall, though, I think we are seeing the tides turn. I mean, on the panel I was with Cameron Forney, the CEO of Select, he actually mentioned that they've seen a rebound in vape sales in this month. So I think the tides are turning a little bit. The good thing with California regulators were they were not very eager to just jump in and do bans. So that was very comforting to know that they understood the industry issues and they were very careful about how do we approach this, how do we encourage transparency, how do we not burden the industry more. I mean, we still have to deal with the tax issue, but that's a whole nother issue.
Whole nother issue. But I think you bring up a good point, and maybe there's an angle there in being more aggressive, a little more assertive with our communication. I think the industry, although everyone's trying to be responsible and, as you said, be transparent, there's not enough information flowing out into the marketplace about all of the good things that are happening to help build public trust. I think more of that needs to continue. It sounds like you agree.
Yes, no, definitely. I think the industry did a lot of admirable things. I mean, I had manufacturers call us the minute the vaping story hit and immediately asking us, can you test for additives? Can you add a panel for vitamin E acetate? Can you add a panel for PEGs and PGs and VGs? You know, as a lab, I'm like, hey, hold on, guys. This takes time to do. What's the urgency? And they're like, no, we want to respond to this because we don't use any of this, but we need to prove that we don't use any of this. And so it was a very interesting response, but immediately wanted to show that they're trying to be good actors. So they did some interesting things, but like you said, it's not a very interesting, sexy story for media, especially when you have something all this hysteria and, you know, people dying and think of the kids. But maybe we can deal with it a little differently the next time something like this happens.
So what advice would you give businesses within the cannabis space who rely on lab testing so that they're addressing some of their own needs and really getting what they want to help advance their businesses?
That's a great question. I wish more people would ask that because as a testing lab in the cannabis industry, we have access to such great instrumentation and we have access to such great scientists. And if you just put yourself in that compliance box, you're actually doing yourself a disservice because having access to a lab that has all these resources, there should be a way more collaborative relationship between cultivators, manufacturers, distribution, and the labs. There are a lot of issues that we have helped some of our clients uncover. One of our clients was making a pre-roll that they were packaging in a certain way and they kept failing for heavy metals even though their R&D never failed for heavy metals. And then we ultimately found out it was part of the packaging that was causing some of that contamination. We had people who were failing for microbial and we were able to find out the source of that microbial contamination. We had done some pesticide testing for these manufacturers that were making some edibles, and the distillate always passed, but they ended up failing. But it was because they were adding oils and chocolates from other industries that had higher levels of pesticides allowable. So, you know, you can use your lab in a lot better way if you have that open communication with them. You can develop better products. So every time you have a new product, rather than surprising a lab with it, it's way more interesting and collaborative to say, hey, I'm thinking of this formulation. Use their scientists to talk about formulation chemistry. Use their scientists to figure out what's the best way to test for this so that we're meeting label claim. I think once we flip that switch on how that relationship works, I think you'll get a lot better data, a lot better products to the market.
Well, it becomes part of their R&D formula.
Exactly.
At the onset of even conceiving a new product. So, excellent point. If you could change one thing about what's happening in science and cannabis and testing, what would you change?
The biggest thing is standardization. We need that push for standardization, but that push needs to also come with an acknowledgement that these methods cannot be perfect unless everyone comes together and discusses this. Science has always worked better when you have peer review and people talk about things. So we need to have better access to information from each other. The other big thing is with standardization, the flip side is also lab shopping is one of those things that definitely happens in this industry. It's sort of the elephant in the room. We know about it. People even know actors that are involved in it, and we just have to kind of deal with it. And I think looking at the data, look at the BCC and any other bureau in any other state should be looking at data coming out of labs. If you notice certain trends, if you notice that this one lab seems to have potency levels 20% higher than everyone else, maybe you should investigate that. If you notice that the lab has not had a failure in 5 months of operation, maybe you should investigate that. The data is available. It's right there. They just need to learn how to look into it. So those are the two big things I think that could really change the track of our cannabis science is we should have some kind of way of dealing with lab shopping. We should have standardization. And then the other big thing is I would love to see more R&D. But unfortunately, more R&D means that we need federal descheduling to happen, because there are lots of labs and lots of scientists that want to study this, and we need the data, but they can't do it because they would lose their funding. So we need to figure out better ways of that. But yeah, these are, sort of big picture, ideal case scenarios. Honestly, if we just start working towards all of them, I would be more than happy.
Swetha, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you. How can our listeners find out more about you and about Cannalysis?
So I am on LinkedIn. Please look me up, Swetha Kaul, and you'll find me. Cannalysis is www.cannalysislabs.com, so you should be able to find them. I'm also part of the CCIA, so if you look at the California Cannabis Industry Association, you'll get a lot of great information there as well. And I think that's about it.
We've been speaking with Swetha Kaul, Scientific Advisor for Cannalysis. This is your host, Lisa Tolner. Thank you for listening.
That's this week's episode of the Collective Wisdom Podcast. Join us each week for another episode on OC Talk Radio, streaming on Thursdays at 3 p.m. And you can download Collective Wisdom wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to visit cacollectivewisdom.com or email us at collectivewisdompodcast@gmail.com to join the conversation. Thank you for listening.